Hello again. This is your math professor, Dr. Hume, coming at you again, and I'd like to continue our conversation about how the New Testament came to be. And today, I'd like to chat with you a little bit, or in this lecture, I'd like to chat with you a little bit about textual criticism, and that's a method of establishing what text it is we read, and literally what words can be determined to be read for the New Testament. I know that sounds a little abstract right now, but let me start the lecture, and I think you'll see what it is I'm talking about. The New Testament that you have, that I had you get for this class, for example, is the New Revised Standard Version. It's a translation, of course. It's an English translation. And it's made up of an English translation that a committee came together and decided would best approximate the Greek text. So the committee had to decide two things. First, they had to decide, how does the Greek text translate best into the English language? That's one set of decisions they had to make. How do we word it in a way that is close to the Greek text, but also meaningful in English, and that gives a good sense of what the original authors may have been trying to indicate to the original audience. But they also had to determine exactly what words to read for the Greek text. And the reason for this is because there are many, many manuscripts from the ancient period, thousands of manuscripts, and it's not so easy to always determine exactly, word for word, what the text says. I mean, there are a lot of, the basic order of the words and selection of the words is similar from document to document, but there are a number of incongruities, and I'm going to demonstrate to you how that works today, and show you how that works and what that looks like. First thing we understand is that in the ancient world there were no printing presses. The printing press wasn't invented until the 14th century by Johannes Gutenberg. And so up until through the Middle Ages, if you wanted a document, you had to copy it. And when we think about literacy in the ancient world, only about maybe 15% of the people in the ancient world could read. And then an even smaller percentage of folks could write, because writing was something that was manual, literally manual labor. That was professional. A person who was a scholar didn't necessarily, they could write, but they didn't necessarily write documents. They didn't copy documents. That was the work of a scribe. And the scribes developed the muscle memory and the ability to do that easily on the materials that they used for writing. But a scholar, you could write some, but you didn't necessarily copy. And one of the interesting things in Galatians, for example, Paul says, "See with what big letters I write." When he signs his name at the end of Galatians, "See with what big letters I write." And scholars have said, "Oh well, he must have had eye problems," or they thought, "Oh well, he must have had some kind of health issues because he wrote." But when did you write with big letters? Well, when you to write, right? When you were children. So, Paul, he could form letters, but he wasn't a professional scribe. And that shows us that when Paul wrote his letters, actually he probably dictated them. He had someone who, a scribe of some sort. Usually these scribes would have been servants or slaves, people who were not necessarily the high status folks. And how did they? What did they use? Well, they made ink, and we found inkwells, for example, in Qumran that they're about the size of a thumbnail. They're pretty small, not a thumbnail, a little, what do you put on your thumb to protect it? A size of all shot glass, I'd say. And you keep ink in there, and they would use reeds, literally reeds that they would cut off branches, or later quills from birds, and they write. Generally, the cheapest material was papyrus, and papyrus was the kind of paper that was like cutting reeds, and you'd sort of cut one side of them, and you'd press them out, and you'd dry them in the sun, and you'd paste them together. If you were really, really wealthy, you had parchment. You were able to purchase leather that could be softened and cleaned and used to keep your text. But you would only trust a very, very good scribe with a piece of parchment with vellum. Wax tablets were used for children, or maybe everyday purposes. You'd have a little reed and a tablet with wax for keeping figure, learning how to write. You could erase it like an Etch-a-Sketch. You could just, after you'd written on it, you could smooth out the wax again and use that. That was the ancient version of an iPad, I suppose you could say. So those are the materials that scribes use. And I guess when you think about the fact that scribes had to copy by hand, you really come to the awareness that they probably did make occasional mistakes. And in fact, they did make mistakes. And because of that, because there are errors from one copy to the next, scholars, before they can even begin to translate, have to determine what the text, as best as possible, what the text said, what the original author might have written. Why can't we just look up the documents? Why can't we look at Paul's original letter to Romans or 1 Thessalonians, the oldest text from 49? Well, it's because we don't have anything that early. We have more than 5,000 manuscripts from the ancient world into the early medieval period. Many of them are very, very fragmentary in nature. Here on the left-hand side, you've got a copy of P52, which is the oldest manuscript here. And, this thing is tiny. It's an inch and a half by 2 inches, really not very large. And it's papyrus. You can tell it's papyrus because I'll show you here in a second. I've got a bigger picture. But you've got thousands of these things, and they're being found still as big. We're finding more and more copies. And we've got some idea of what the text may have said from, say, an ancient translation into Latin, or the ancient church fathers, when they cited text, we have then evidence of what the text may have said for the document that they were using. But the oldest we have is this document, P52. P52 dates to the 2nd century, probably between 125 and 150. This is from John 18, and you can make out some letters. There's an omicron. Here's another omicron, an upsilon, a delta, an epsilon, a nu, and an alpha. This word, udena, here means nothing. Hina, that's a iota, that's a nu, that's an alpha right here. Hina means so that. So you can make it, I can kind of make it out a little bit. Of course, this is lovely. It's been expanded. You can, with the computer, with digital images, it's nice. You can just expand them, and you can see this is written on papyrus. See the way that the reeds go in one direction. They would have put out these reeds, and you can see literally the fibers of the seeds of the plant here. They'd flatten it out one way, and then they'd paste on the other side, on the reverse side, the reeds going the other way, and you could write on both sides. This is called recto because this is on the front side, on the reeds that go from left to right. So this is the right-hand side of the of the page. The reverse, though, the reverse, the reed fiber fragments go down. So this is, it's written on both sides. This thing dates to around 125 to 150. It's kept in Ireland, and I think that's where the John Rylands Library is. And it's about what? How many lines of text is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines. Some of it is very fragmentary. This, I think, looks like a omega here. I'm not sure what that is. So I can make out some of these letters. I can't make out others. And then scholars can compare this to the Greek text from other manuscripts that we have, and they've been able to determine this is from John 18. Now, if you realize that John was written around 90, this was probably a copy of a copy, maybe a copy of a copy of a copy. So we don't have the original documents. It'd be nice if we had the original document that the evangelist actually wrote. We don't. And so we have to compare the documents to try to figure out what the is. Now, the best manuscripts that we have are from the 4th century. The probably most beautiful one is this Codex Vaticanus that's kept in the Vatican Library. It's been there in the Middle Ages. This is a beautiful a vellum manuscript. In other words, a manuscript written on leather. So the church was much wealthier when this text was written. You can see the 3 columns. This really looks like a book, and it's a codex. It's in the form of a book. It's in excellent condition. And this is a page from the beginning of Romans. And here you see the stamp of the Vatican Library right in between the text to make sure that they didn't copy it, didn't block anything. And it's illuminated even, and it has decorations up here. And here's sort of title page, and this looks like some kind of a numerical system here. So it's in wonderful condition. Here's another one of these 4th century manuscripts, is the Sinaiticus, and my font didn't translate it. This actually usually is written as an aleph, a Hebrew letter, and I've got it later on in the slide I'll show to you. You can see that this has 4 columns, and this contained the whole Bible, this codex did, plus a few other letters, which is interesting. We talked in our other lecture about the canon formation, that the canon wasn't quite settled. By the 4th century, it was becoming settled. So this has the whole Bible, plus it has a couple of other Epistle of Barnabas and Shepherd of Hermes. Apparently, the congregation that read this codex viewed those texts as also Scripture. So again, canon formation wasn't complete yet, and some communities were reading some texts that weren't didn't eventually make it into the New Testament. This is a chapter from Luke 19 to 20. If you look real carefully, you can see with eagle eyes places where you have in between the margins some letters. Let me go to the next slide. I can show it more carefully. So you can see here where the scribe has made some insertions. Those are corrections. So the scribe, apparently, when he was copying an earlier manuscript, missed some words or needed to correct some words, and put some corrections either in the margins or at the bottom of the page, to demonstrate that, hey, look, there's some other text here, that I compared this manuscript to, and I had to make corrections, or as I was going back over this, I found that I had made some mistakes. I'm not sure whether it's the same scribe or the corrections are in a later hand, but in any case, the corrections indicate textual variance, and that's the main thing. Is that it's compared to another document, and they realized, there's something wrong here. Let me show you how this works. If you get a chance, look at the text of Mark chapter 1. Mark chapter 1. We can read it together, just the first verse or so. And if you have your study Bibles, and I really would encourage you to get a good New Revised Standard Version Study Bible, either the Oxford Study Bible or the New Interpreter Study Bible. They're both excellent. But usually when you read the NRSV, it gives you a little, some clues about textual criticism. So when I read Mark chapter 1, it says, the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, as it is written in the prophet Isaiah, and so on and so forth. And I see in my study Bible 2 notes. After good news, I see a note, footnote A. It means good news or gospel. It's just another translation for gospel. And then under the B, it says the beginning of the good news of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And the NRSV is very faithful. It says other ancient authorities lack the Son of God. What they're talking about are some manuscripts actually have the Son of God, and there's evidence that other manuscripts did not have the Son of God in that text. Let me show you. Let me show you how this works. This is the Vaticanus, that beautiful text that we were talking about, and this is the beginning of the Gospel of Mark. First thing you may notice, just looking at it, does this look like any other text, like a normal text? Well, of course it's in Greek, but apart from that, what would you expect to see in any written text? You don't see spaces. You see spaces between the words? Isn't that interesting? There's no spaces in between the words. And that would seem to indicate that this was written for an oral audience. The Bible was written for people who listened to it. Remember, only 15% of the people could read. So most people experience the Bible through reading out loud. And you learn to read by reading out loud with someone standing by your side while you were reading, pointing to each word to show you where the words were. And then once you've read it once, you learn to read it again. Let me go ahead and read this. I'll do it as if I was by your side. Arche, the beginning, two of the euangeliou, that's the word, gospel, literally good, euangelion, good news, of Jesu Christou huiou theou. And maybe you noticed this little line over the names for Jesus Christ. Jesu is the Greek word for Jesus. Christou is Christ. Huiou means son. And then theou, which son of God. And so this is the word for God. Now, over Jesu and Christou and theou, there's a little line. And you notice those aren't four letters long. They're only 2 letters long. Well, if you're going to copy the Gospel of Mark, there's a lot of words that are going to repeat themselves, like Jesus and Christ and God. And so it's a convention by the time that these scribes are writing to simply shorten them to 2 letters and put a line over it. Everyone knows what that means. Shorthand. It saves space, it saves the scribe's hand, and it saves material, valuable, precious parchment. So they did take shortcuts. So this is then the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, Son of God, is how this text reads. Well, exactly what you have in your biblical text, right? So it looks like the translators decided to follow the Vaticanus. Well, let's see what happens when we get to the Sinaiticus. Here's again, this is explanation. In this manuscript, the scribes copied Jesus Christ, Son of God, right? And Son is spelled in full, and these are abbreviated. Now let's look at another manuscript, the Sinaiticus. Again, from the 4th century. You can tell. Look, it's center justified, which is interesting. Arche, the same word, two. So the beginning of the euangelion, Ooh, look, he just skipped the line right in the middle of that word. Euangelion. Now, I know you don't have a Greek and you're not familiar with the letters, but I'm just showing you. He's written out that word, and he just right in the middle of the word skips the line because he ran out of space. Yeah. The beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. And then it goes on, kathos, as graptai is written, and to Yesaya to prophetes. So as is written in Isaiah the prophet, what? Jesus Christ, as is written. What happened to Son of God? Well, you see it? It's up here. It's in between the text. Now, what that indicates is there's something going on here. The scribe probably was following a manuscript that didn't have Jesus. It had Jesus Christ, but it didn't have Son of God. Jesu Christu hu Theou, and it's abbreviated. Both words are abbreviated, and they're missing here. And so when he was comparing this to another manuscript, maybe like something like the Vaticanus, he says, oh, I got to write that in. I got to write that's missing here. So the original hand that copied the Gospel of Mark for the Sinaiticus was following an earlier copy that did not have the Son of God in it. Now, how did it slip out? Well, I don't know. Could it be that Mark didn't put Son of God in it? It's interesting. It's an interesting theory. One of the things that Mark does in his theology is the recognition of Jesus as Son of God doesn't really come until the very, very, very end of the gospel, and the one who recognizes him is the Roman thread at the cross. He says, surely this is the Son of God. Right? Not until that point do the disciples don't quite get it. Nobody gets it. So theologically, it would make sense that maybe just to keep the reader in suspense, Mark didn't tell you that Jesus Christ was Son of God at the very beginning. It's certainly possible. It's not crazy, right, in terms of Markan theology. But, it's a crucial piece of information to know about Jesus Christ. So let's see if we can see what another manuscript says in the 4th century. And again, this is just the explanation. Jesus Christ and the books of God is up here in the margin of the line. It's a later scribe. A later scribe. I think it's a different hand. Okay. Now, this is the Alexandrinus, another great 4th century manuscript. RK, the beginning, to Euangelium, beautiful hand here. Jesus Christ, Son of God, all in one line. And in fact, you've got a little word in between Son of God. You've got an article, the, Son of the God. Sometimes theos takes an article, Paul theos. And we don't put the article in. We don't say the God, but the Greeks, that was a typical thing to do. So he's corrected it. He's even added an article here, and so he differs both from the other two texts, but he's got it all in here. Again, Jesus Christ, Son of God, but again, he's improved the text by adding an article. Proper Greek, he says, would have the article. Maybe Mark, who was not such a good writer, didn't include the article. By the time that Alexandrian is writing, he's made a correction. Now, I don't know whether the scribe himself has made a correction or whether he's following an earlier manuscript that we no longer have a copy of that made this correction to the text. But there's a correction that's being made. What does this tell you? Well, it tells you that biblical scholars are kind of pedantic, right? I mean, but we have to be because the text is important. It's important to know what the text says. And we have to go through, and I don't do this. This is not my field. This is not my specialty. But there are a number of New Testament scholars for whom this is their specialty, and they go through and they compare manuscript by manuscript. It used to be they had to travel around and do it. Now, of course, we have digital copies, and in fact, all of these manuscripts at some point are going to be released on a CD, so that or DVD or whatever, so that we can all have copies of them and compare them ourselves if we want to. But for now, you have experts who spend their entire lives working on these texts in order to come up with the most reliable text that they possibly can. Because we know that when folks copied, they made mistakes. Some of it was due to faulty hearing. Well, we also know that the scribes, when they copied, sometimes you'd have one scribe in the front giving dictation, and you'd have 10 or 12 scribes out making copies. That was a very quick way of making copies, because you could make 12 copies at one time. One scribe could read, the other scribes could copy it all. But if you had a scribe who wasn't hearing very well, maybe he was sitting by the window where a dog was barking, he might miss things up, or maybe they'd exchange consonants, and they'd write things, they hear them differently. Some people do that still. When I was a child, I used to say Paschetti, because I couldn't say spa, So sometimes consonants are interchanged, and sometimes while they're listening, they're not paying attention. They substitute a synonym for the word, or they vary the sequence, the words, or they know that, I know this passage, right? But they might have heard the same passage in Mark that they're copying in Luke, and instead of writing it down what the guy was saying, whoever is reading, if they're copying Luke and he's reading in front of you, and they instead, I know what this says, but they write it down in Mark. So you get this conflation or assimilation to other passages. Sometimes the errors have to do with spelling or grammar, or like we saw with the Alexandrinus, they included an article where it shouldn't have been, or like if you got, again, like I said, if you've got a parallel passage, they say, oh well, that's different in Mark than it is in Luke. We've got to make it the same. Right, or they'll this psalm sounds like the other three psalms, so let's just write one psalm. We'll put it together, so they'll conflate the different variants. Sometimes you've got a scribe will write in the note, I've been to this place and this is the wrong place, so they'll change. They'll fix a historical or geographical error in the document, and sometimes they'll come along and make changes due to doctrinal considerations. They weren't willy-nilly about their changes. They were very, very careful. Sometimes if they're copying by hand, they might make mistakes. You can see here how the sigma is very similar to the epsilon in Greek, or the omicron is very similar to the theta. Remember, again, it wasn't until the modern period that people had eyeglasses. So if you had a scribe who couldn't see very well, he could, or if he's reading, he might skip a word. You've done that before. If you're reading a book, you skip a word or you skip a line. Or if you're copying something, you copy the same word or group of words twice. It's just, not seeing or not paying attention. I don't think they made these things by mistake, and they were slavish sometimes in their copying. They sometimes wrote down whatever they found, regardless. We have some manuscripts where you'll be reading along in Mark, and then you'll see, or in John or one of the Gospels, and you'll see the text will suddenly say, "Oh, you stupid scribe, you copied this wrong." Like, why is that in the middle of this manuscript? Why is that in the middle of the text? Well, apparently someone had written that in the margin previously of a scribe who had made a mistake, and the next scribe, the next generation, copied what was in the margin into the text because it was there. Had to copy it. Couldn't just leave it. Right? So they were very, very cautious. I guess the main point that I want to make from all this, and let's go back and end on by looking at a pretty manuscript here. The main point that I'd like to make in giving you all this lecture is that the Bible that you have is a product of hundreds of hands, thousands of hands, who have been faithfully copying these documents over thousands of years. And if you can imagine a scribe sitting in a cell in the cold, copying these things somewhere in Northern Europe in the medieval period, just imagine the kind of work that went into the fact that you have a beautiful English translation to read. Just appreciate that, and appreciate the fact that the scribal work is still continuing. We are still searching for more documents and trying to get back to the most original translation, the most original text that we can possibly get to. One other note, well, I'll leave it at that. I think that's good. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and if you have any questions, please do. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and if you have any questions, please do